Today, we're going to create a simple button in Unreal and Unity. Let's go! So we're in the middle of a series of videos on creating procedural shapes and patterns. Last week, we created this rectangle sign distance field node. Today, we're going to use this rectangle shape to create a shader that generates a button. If you haven't seen last week's video or the videos before that, I'll put a link to the playlist down in the description. Alright, to be clear up front, we're not going to have time in this video to get into making the button functional. We're just going to create the shader. We may cover hooking up the button in a future video, but for today, we're just going to make the visual portion of the button. Historically, artists have created buttons and other UI elements just using textures, but the button we're going to make today doesn't use any textures at all. There are several advantages to making a button using this technique that I'm going to show you today. First, it doesn't use any texture memory, so it saves texture memory that you might want to use for something else. Second, it's resolution independent, and that means it looks great regardless of the camera distance or the screen resolution. So you can put it on a small cell phone screen or a giant 8K monitor. And third, it's really fast to iterate and adjust because you don't have to jump out of your game engine to Photoshop or other image editing software and re-import the textures. You can just make all of your edits directly in the editor in real time. There are some other advantages too, but that's enough talking for now. Let's get in and make the button. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is create a brand new subgraph. So we're going to pick Create Shader Graph Subgraph, and I'm just going to call this Simple Button, and we'll open it up. Now there are two outputs that we're going to want for our button. The first one is color. So let's select our output node here. And the first output is going to be color. And it's a vector 3. And the second output is going to be the alpha. And that's going to be a float. So we're going to be generating color and alpha. And the core of our button, as I said, is going to be the rectangular sign distance field node that we created last week. So let's open up our procedural folder, sign distance fields, and there's our rectangle node, and we'll just drop it right in. All right, so there's the rectangle that we want. And we want our button to be slightly longer than it is tall. So I'm going to shrink it down just a little bit and maybe expand it out just a little bit. And the aspect ratio and the dimensions that you choose to make are completely up to you. So you can set these size values here to whatever you want. And maybe we'll just give the corners just a little bit of rounding, just to kind of make the button look nice around the edges. This is one of my favorite features of this particular node, by the way, the rounded corners. All right, you can see already we've got something that looks kind of like a button, just there in the preview. But let's do some more with this. In order to make this resolution independent, what we're looking at here is the fill output of the rectangle node. But we also have the SDF, or the signed distance field of the rectangle node. And if we're using the fill output, that's going to be resolution dependent. So if I zoom in on that, eventually I'm going to see the softness of the edge, because we have this edge min and edge max value here. So that's not resolution independent. If I want to make it resolution independent, I need to use our anti-aliasing node. So that's a node that we created in a previous video, and it's in this helpers area. So there's our anti-aliasing node. And what this node does, I've explained this before, but it basically resolves our SDF into a shape in a resolution independent way, so that the edges are perfectly anti-aliased regardless of how far or close I am to the object, and regardless of the screen resolution. So if I just add my anti-aliasing node there, set the cutoff to 0, and then use a 1-, Now I have a button shape that's going to be resolution independent. So I want to use both the SDF and the SDF stroke. The stroke value here is going to give me an outline. So if I just add a preview really quickly, there you can see I've got an outline of my button. And now that I have that preview there, you can see I can set my stroke thickness value, and we can choose how thin or thick we want our outline to be. And so in order to make the button outline, I can just copy these nodes here. And instead of wiring the SDF output, I can wire the SDF stroke output. And now I have a really nice outline for my button. All right, now I've got these masks. I've got a button mask, a fill mask, and an outline mask. But I need to use the masks to create some color. So let's do that next. I think what I want to do is open up our Blackboard here and add the input parameters that I'm going to need. The first one that I'm going to need is UV coordinates, and that's a vector 2. The second one that I'm going to need is dimensions, and that's also going to be a vector 2. And here I've set my size to 0.8 and 0.4, so I think I'll just default my dimensions to that. And then I'm going to need a color parameter, and we're going to use this one for button color. And then we're also going to have a drop shadow, so let's add another color for the shadow color. And then we'll add a third color for the outline color. So I'm just going to call this outline color. For the button color, I'm going to set its default to this kind of blue shade. For the outline color, I'm just going to reorder these. So I've got button color, outline color, and shadow color. For the outline color, I'm going to set it to kind of this darker blue. And then for the shadow color, we're just going to default that to black. All right, I'm also in the future going to add some other parameters for the states of the button. So for example, if I mouse over the button, does it change its appearance? If I press the button, what does it look like then? When the button is active versus inactive, what happens to the button? We're going to get into that in a minute, but I'm not going to add those parameters right now. First, what we want to do is shade our button. So I'm going to bring in my button parameter here, or my button color parameter. And what we want to do is make a really nice gradient with this color. And so what I'm going to do is add a lerp node, and we're going to blend between this color and a variation of the color depending on where we are on the button. So we're going to make a vertical gradient so that the button's kind of lighter here on the top and darker here on the bottom. And so what I'm going to do is just take the color of the button and we'll multiply it by 0.3 just to darken that color down. And then we're going to blend between the original color and the darkened down version of the color based on a linear gradient. So in a previous episode, we created this node here called linear gradient. And I'm going to take this linear gradient, and here we're seeing a preview for the horizontal gradient, but the gradient coming out of this V, or the vertical gradient, looks like this. You can see it's going from black to white. So we're going to use this gradient as our lerping value. And now you can see I've got this nice gradient that goes from blue, light blue up here at the top, and then it gets just a little bit darker as we go down to the bottom. All right, at this point, for a linear gradient, we want to scale it so that it fits inside our button. And the way that we know if it fits inside our button is we have this button dimensions value that we've created here. And I'm just going to plug that parameter into size. And that gives us the dimensions of 0.8 and 0.4, these default values that we gave it. But we also want to scale our gradient by those values. And we don't actually have a node that can do that scaling. So right now we're going to take a little bit of a detour, and create another subgraph that we can use for scaling. So if we jump out here and come over here to our procedural library, if we come down to our UVs folder, you can see we have this node that we created called move, and scaling is going to be similar to move. So what I'm going to do is just copy and paste our move subgraph, and we're going to call this one scale. And I'll open up our new scale subgraph, and we're going to change the move subgraph so that it does scaling instead. All right, so the first thing that we're going to change is here we have our UVs coming in. We have our move value, but instead of move, we want scale. And I'm just going to default this to 0.5 and 0.5. And then we also need to know the pivot point. So I'm going to add a new parameter here, and it's a vector 2, and we'll call it pivot point. And we're just going to make the pivot point in the center, which in this case is 0.5, 0.5. All right, so we have our UV coordinates coming in here. And what we need to do with the UV coordinates is take our scale value, and we need to make sure that we don't scale negative. And so I'm going to add a maximum node here and plug our scale into that. And we're just going to clamp it here at 0.001. So our scale doesn't ever go smaller than that. And then the next thing that we're going to do is take the reciprocal, or basically 1 divided by our scale value, and then we're going to use that value and multiply our UV coordinates by that. So I'm just going to delete these nodes here. Now we're going to take our reciprocal value and multiply our UV coordinates by the scale value coming in. And now we need to apply our pivot point. So I'm going to bring in our pivot point, and I'm going to subtract it from our UV coordinates. And what this does is it shifts everything over to 0. And then we're going to multiply it by our scale, and then we're going to add back in our pivot point value. So we shift everything over to 0, then we scale, and then we shift it back. And that's why we do this kind of add or subtract and then add here. And that's it. We just wire that out, and that's our scale value. Now our move value had 2 outputs here, UV raw and UV repeat. We don't need that. We can just call our output out, and we can get rid of this second one here. All right, there is our scale subgraph. Let's go ahead and save that. And we'll jump back over here to our simple button and add in our scale node. So if we come up here to procedural, UVs, there's our scale node. And we can just connect this right up to our linear gradient. And the scale that we're going to use is the dimensions of our rectangle. So we'll just wire that in. And now what you can see is the dimensions value is changing where our gradient is happening. If we set our dimension over here to like 0.1, you'll see that it gets shrunk down quite a bit. And if we set it to 1, it gets expanded out all the way. And so what that's going to do is it's going to change this gradient depending on the height of our button, which is the effect that we're looking for. All right, before we get too much further, we need to bring in our UV coordinate parameter here and hook that up. And so what I'm going to do is the same thing that I've done with pretty much all of the other UV inputs. I'm going to pick use custom binding here, set this to UV 0. Then I'm going to add a branch on input connection node and connect up our UV input parameter here to the input and the connected port. And for not connected, we'll just use our standard UV coordinate node and wire that in, so that if our UV input port for our button is not connected, it'll just use the standard UV coordinates. All right, now there are some other things that we're going to do in between here, but for now I'm just going to take these UV coordinates and wire them into the UVs of our rectangle there. And also I'm going to wire them into the UVs of our scale there. Okay, so just to make this interesting, The next thing that I'm going to do is make it so that we can press our button. And we're going to do that with our UV coordinates here. So I'm going to add a new input parameter here, and this is a Boolean. And we're going to call this one pressed. So when our button is pressed, what do we want it to do? Well, if I click on this button, it's probably going to move down. And so what we're going to do is add a move node here. There's our move node. And we'll connect up our UV coordinates. And we just want it to move down just a little bit, maybe down and to the right. And so I'm going to make my move node a value of 0.01 and 0.01. And so now we have UV coordinates when it's not moved coming out of here, and UV coordinates when it is moved coming out of here. And we can add a branch node. And I'm going to connect the predicate to this pressed parameter that we added. And so if our button is pressed, we're going to want to use the moved UV coordinates. But if it's not pressed, we're going to want to use the not moved or just the standard UVs. And now I'm going to connect up my branch node, the UV coordinates coming out of here, to both of these other locations. So now I can take these UV coordinates that I've calculated, these new ones, and let's see. If I select my pressed parameter over here, and we come and take a look at our button, if I set the pressed value to true, you can see that the button is moving down and to the right just a little bit. And so what I can do with this parameter is I can connect it up to my game so that when the player presses the button, it sets this parameter to true, and that drives the button so that it moves down and to the right. Pretty cool. So you can see how I'm using a shader to create something that actually functions or that has different states. So this pressed state is the first one that we've created, but we're also going to create a couple of others. All right, let's go ahead and start incorporating the color that we created here. So what I'm going to do is grab our outline color parameter and drag it in. And we want to blend between the button color and the outline color. So in order to do that, I'm going to add a lerp node. And we're going to blend between the button color and the outline color. And for that, we need to use our outline that we've created here. So based on this outline mask, now we have the button color and we have the outline color. And I think our outline is maybe just a little bit too thin. And so I'm going to come over here to stroke thickness and make it 0.02. There we go. Now it's just a little bit more apparent. Now we don't actually have to do this now, but just to make our button a little bit more pretty, temporarily, I'm going to add together the button mask and the outline mask and saturate the result. And then I'm going to multiply what we've got here with this mask that we've created here. And now what you can see is we've got our nice button. We've got our outline and we've got our interior fill. And again, if we select our pressed value and change it, you can see that our button is shifting down and to the right as we press it. And if we wanted to, instead of using black here, we could create a different color background for our button. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's make a color here, and let's make the background color kind of a gray value. So now we can blend between our button color and our background color using our button mask. There we go. Hey, that looks pretty nice. All right, good deal. The next thing that we can add to make our button look a little bit more pretty is a drop shadow. So in order to create a drop shadow, we need to grab a new copy of our Rectangle SDF. So this version of our Rectangle is creating the body of the button itself. But let's go ahead and copy and paste our drop shadow, copy and paste our Rectangle SDF to make a drop shadow. So in order for our drop shadow to be offset from our button, we need to change it just a little bit. We need to take our UV coordinates coming out of here and add another move node. And we're just going to offset our drop shadow by 0.01 and 0.01. And then take those UV coordinates and wire them in here. And we're going to bring in our dimensions and connect that to size so that our drop shadow is the same dimension as our button. And right now, our edge min and edge max, our edge max is set to 0.01, but if we want our drop shadow to be just a little bit blurry, we can increase our edge max value. I'm going to set it to 0.08. And now you can see the edge of our drop shadow is just a little bit blurry. So that's the effect that we're looking for. And let's go ahead and check this keep aspect ratio box for both of our Rectangle SDFs. All right, so we've got our drop shadow offset using the move node here, and we made it blurry. So now let's go ahead and use our drop shadow. We can come over here with our fill, and let's multiply our drop shadow by 0.5. And now what we can do is take this combination of our button and our button outline here and find whichever of these two is greater. So is our drop shadow greater or is our button value greater? So I'm just going to use a maximum node and we'll connect up our drop shadow there. And now you can see I've calculated the alpha of our button. So with our maximum node, I can just connect that up to the alpha. And this alpha value I can use to determine the transparency. So you can see our button is going to be solid and our drop shadow is going to be transparent. Now I'm looking at this here and I think maybe our drop shadow needs just a little bit of adjusting so that it looks more like a drop shadow. And so I'm going to go ahead and play around with some parameters and see if I can make that look a little bit nicer. First thing that I want to do is move it just a little bit. So I'm going to play with our movement values here. So I offset our drop shadow. And the other thing that I think I want to do is scale it down just a little bit. And so I'm going to take our dimensions here and multiply by 0.9. Let's see what happens if we do this. Maybe 0.95, just to scale our shadow down just a little bit. All right, that looks pretty good. You can see we've got the button here and then we've got the drop shadow there. Nice. Okay, now I'm going to undo what I've done here just for preview purposes. And we're going to bring in our shadow color parameter. And we're going to blend between our shadow color and our button color here. So let's add another lerp. And we'll make our shadow color the background and our button color the foreground. And we'll use our added together button and outline color mask to blend between the two of those. Okay, so now we've got our shadow color here in the background and we've got our button color here in the foreground. And at this point, we can take this color and pass it out because now we've got the color of our button and we've got the alpha of our button, and that's looking pretty cool. But there are a couple of parameters that we can still add. So let's go ahead and do that. We want to add the states for our button. So first, let's go ahead and add a selected state. So I'm going to come up here to our blackboard and create another Boolean. And we'll call this one selected. So this could be if you have, so did you see how I selected that there and it got a nice blue outline around it? That's what selected does. And so we're going to add that to our button. And so the first thing that I need to do is drag in our selected parameter, and we're going to take our button color here, and I'm going to multiply it by 1.3. And so what this is doing is when the button is selected, it's going to brighten it up. So let's go ahead and add a branch. So this branch is going to blend between our brightened version of the color, if it's true, and the base version of the color, if it's false. And then we'll wire this into this lerp here and this multiply here. All right, so now if I set my selected value, if you watch this color here, if I set my selected value to true, it's brightening it when it's selected. The next thing that I want to do is make it so our pressed state is a little bit more interesting. And so in order to do that, what I'm going to do is make the color of the button change when the button is pressed. So I'll bring in our pressed parameter here. So right now the pressed just moves the button down and to the right, but we're also going to make it change color. So I'm going to add another branch node here and connect the pressed Boolean up to the predicate. And when pressed is false, we're going to use this color. But when pressed is true, we're going to darken the color a bit. So I'm just going to add a multiply here, and we're going to multiply the color by 0.25. So when the button is pressed, it's just going to be 25% as bright as it normally is. All right, and then we'll wire the result of that branch into here. Okay, so now here is my pressed state, and if we zoom into our button here, if I set pressed to true, it's going to move the button down and make it get a little bit darker. Okay, and then there's one last functionality that I want to add to our button, and that is active. So we're going to add one last Boolean, and we'll call this active. And like, for example, if I have a window and the window is not selected and my mouse is not on it, generally that kind of tries to fade that window into the background. And the way that that works is by desaturating. So right now I've got this nice blue color for my button, but we want to make it so the button can be inactive. So I'm going to bring active in, and we're going to make the colored version and the desaturated version of this button. And the way that we do that is pretty easy. I can just add a dot product node here. And to desaturate the color of our button, I can just use some values here that represent the perceptual desaturation weights. Okay, so I've got a value of 0.21, 0.7152, and 0.07. So these are the perceptual desaturation values. And you can see the result of our dot product is a desaturated button. And so now all I have to do is add another branch. And if active is true, we're going to use our regular colored version. But if it's false, we're going to use our desaturated version. And we'll pass that out to color. Okay, we have set up our entire button. We have our UV coordinates, we have our dimensions, we have our button color, our outline color, our shadow color, and we have our pressed, selected, and active states. So now let's save this and give our button a try. So we can come in here to our temporary testing shader and delete out this rectangle, and let's add our simple button subgraph. And the one thing that we forgot to do is to set our preview to 2D. So we'll save that as a 2D preview. So now you can see our nice 2D preview here. And we probably also want to set our active state to true by default. So we'll come into our active state and set the default value to true. Okay, so there we go. Now we have our button and we have our alpha value coming out. Let's connect up our base color there. And if we set our shader here to be, instead of unlit, if we set this to canvas, now it's going to give us an alpha value that we can use there, and we can connect up our alpha. So now you can see in our preview here, we have a really nice looking button. And obviously we can adjust our parameters here to make the button however we want. We can hook up our button, we can hook up a button color, an outline color, we can change the pressed state, and we can change the selected state. So when your mouse is inside, the button gets a little bit brighter to tell you, your mouse is over me. And if the button is inactive, we can desaturate it. So pretty cool. We've got a simple button here, and it's got 3 different state parameters that we can use. We can use active, selected, and pressed. And we've got inputs for the UVs, for the colors, and we can even change the color of the drop shadow if we want to. Let's go ahead and hook up some colors here and just kind of play around with this. So there's our shadow color. Here is our button color, and obviously it's not going to look that great if it's black. So let's set it to something maybe a little bit more cheery. There's a big red button, maybe an orange, yellow button. Nice. And that works with our state. So we can press our button, we can select our button. Maybe we want to set our outline color to something a little bit darker and a little bit more orange. Yeah. So now we have a subgraph that allows us to create a simple button. And we can also expose these parameters here and hook them up to our game engine so that when the user mouses over or deselects or presses the button is able to procedurally respond to what the user's doing. All right, so that's our tutorial for today in Unity. Let's switch over to Unreal and I'll show you how to make this same simple button there. All right, here we are in Unreal, and today we're going to start out by picking our procedural folder, and I'm going to right click in here and pick material function, and we're going to call our new material function simple button. And we'll go ahead and open it and get started creating our button. And just like we did in Unity, we're going to make 2 outputs here. The first one is going to be color. And the second output is going to be alpha. All right, and we need to start out with our base, and our base is going to be our Rectangle SDF. And so for that, we'll come down here into our SDFs folder and pick our rectangle node and drop it right in. Okay, and just for now, let's wire the fill into the output color there. So now you can see we've got our nice rectangle, and we'll set it to unlit so that it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. Okay, in order to make our button, we need some inputs. And for the inputs, we're going to make our first function input the UV coordinates. So I'm just going to call this UV, and we're going to set it to vector 2. And we're going to make the default UVs the texture coordinate node here. So I'm just going to connect that up to the preview input. We also need dimensions. So I'm going to copy this input here and we'll give it some dimensions. I think we defaulted it in Unity to 0.8 and 0.4. So let's see what that looks like when we connect it up to our Rectangle SDF. Yeah, now we've got a nice button shape. That looks great. And then we also need inputs for button color. We're going to make this a vector 3. And then for the default color, let's just set it to kind of a nice blue. And give it a good name, button color. And we need an outline color. And for this one, let's make it a little bit darker blue. And then we also need a shadow color. And we'll go ahead and make that one black. Okay, those are some good parameters to work with for now. So we'll wire up our UV coordinates here. And I think we also want to round our edges. So I'm going to add a vector 4 value here. And I think on the Unity version, we made these like 0.1. So let's see what that looks like if we wire this into our corner radii. Yeah, there we go. We've got some nice round edges. All right, now let me show you what I was talking about in Unity when we were doing kind of the resolution independent thing. Right now we have our edge min and edge max values set up so that our edge max is 0.01. And our edge looks pretty sharp here, but if we zoom in here, you can see the closer we get, the more you can see this little gradient here. And what we want to do is make it so that that value is sharp and smoothly anti-aliased, regardless of like how far away the camera is or what the resolution of the screen is. And so in order to do that, instead of using the fill output here, we're going to use the SDF output, and we're going to connect it up to our anti-aliasing node. So that's in our helpers folder. So here's our anti-aliasing node that we created in a previous video. And I'm just going to drag this in and connect it to gradient. And we're going to set the cutoff to 0. And then the result of this we can wire in. Now you can see it's inverted, so we just need to add a 1- node here. And now what we have is an edge that's going to be really nice and sharp, but also really nice and anti-aliased. So let's zoom in here again. And now you can see, like, no matter how close I zoom in, this edge is always going to be perfectly sharp and also anti-aliased. Now that's a key, because I have a lot of you that are asking, well, instead of using this anti-aliasing node, why don't you just use a step node? And the reason that we're not using step is because step doesn't create anti-aliasing. It would create a perfectly jagged aliased line, whereas this anti-aliasing node that we created previously makes that line anti-aliased. Hence the name, right? Okay, now that we've got our nice looking button here, well, this is actually just a button mask. And what we actually want to do is create a nice gradient color here. So let's grab our button color, and we're going to blend between our button color and a variation of our button color. We're just going to multiply it by 0.3. And we're going to blend between that based on our linear gradient. So let's bring in our linear gradient node. And we're going to use the vertical gradient. All right, so now you can see I have a nice gradient here, and it goes from kind of bright blue to a darker blue. But we want this gradient to occur inside the dimensions of our button that we have here. And in order to do that, we need to scale our linear gradient down so that it matches these dimensions. And so we need a new material function node to do that. So in order to do that, I'm going to come here to my UVs folder, and I'm going to grab my material function node that I already have called move, and I'm going to copy and paste it. And I'm going to rename this one to scale instead. And so what this node is going to do is it's going to allow us to scale our UV coordinates. So let's just go ahead and open this up. And you can see what we have here is our UV coordinates coming in. And then we have this move parameter. And I'm going to rename this to scale. And let's just set the defaults to 0.5 and 0.5. So we're going to take our UV coordinates. Right now we're adding them, and that's not what we want to do. So let's go ahead and delete that. And we'll just set our output to out. And then the other input that we need, in addition to our UVs, our scale, and our third one is going to be the pivot point. And that's where the scale is happening from, and it's going to be the center. So we'll just leave it at 0.5, 0.5. So now we're going to take our UV coordinates, and we're going to subtract out the pivot point. This is how pivot points often work. You subtract them out, then you do the operation, and then you add them back in. So in this case, the operation that we're going to be doing is our scale. And before we multiply by our scale, the first thing that we need to do is add a little bit of protection here for ourselves. We're going to set our maximum scale, or we're going to take the scale and do a max with 0.001 so that our scale can't get any smaller than that. Basically, we're preventing negative scale here. And then we're going to divide by, or we're going to divide 1 by this value. So we're taking the reciprocal. And now we can take this value and multiply it by our UV coordinates, which is what's actually going to be doing the scaling. And so now we've taken our UVs and we've scaled them down or up by our scale value. And now we need to add back in our pivot point value. So we'll do an add here and wire our pivot point value in. And then this is our final output. So there we go. That is our scale material function, and it's pretty simple. So we can save that and come back to our simple button here. And now we can bring in our scale material function, and we can just connect it up to the UV coordinates of our gradient node there. And then just like we did with our rectangle, we can connect up our dimensions to our scale value there, and we can connect up our UV coordinates to our scale value there as well. So we've got our UV coordinates coming in, and then we're scaling them by our dimensions, and then we're using that to generate our linear gradient. And what that's going to do is clamp our gradient, or adjust our gradient so that it fits inside the dimensions of our button. And so now if we adjust our dimensions, you can see I've got my 0.4 value here. If I set this to 0.1, now you can see that our gradient here is adjusting based on the dimensions of our button. And if I set it to 0.9, now we've got a big gradient. And if we set it back to 0.4, now we've got a gradient that has adjusted itself to fit the dimensions of the button that we're creating. Okay, cool. So now we've got the color of the button, but we will also want to use our outline color. So here's our outline color that we've created, and we can blend between the button color and the outline color based on our outline color mask. And we actually haven't generated that yet, so let's go ahead and do that. We have our SDF coming out here, and we also have our SDF stroke, so we can just go ahead and copy and paste these nodes. And instead of connecting our SDF, we're going to connect our SDF stroke. This is going to give us our outline. There you can see our nice outline, and we can use that mask to blend between our button color and our outline color. And so the preview ends up looking something like that. That's pretty nice looking. All right, now our outline is maybe a little bit too thick right now. So we can come down here to our SDF node, and here we've got our stroke thickness. So I'm just going to connect up a value here of 0.02, and that's going to give me a nice outline value. And now you can see I've got a really nice blend between the background gradient and our outline color. Okay, and then the last thing that we need to do is blend between this color that we've created here and the shadow color. So I'll grab our shadow color parameter, and we're going to add another lerp here. And so our background is going to be our shadow color, and our foreground is going to be our button color. And we're going to blend between these two based on, so here is our button mask and our outline mask. And we're going to add the two of these together and then saturate the result. And this is the mask that is our entire button, the button and the outline together. And so we can use that mask to blend between our button color and our shadow color. Now you can see we've got our shadow color in the background there, and our button color and outline color in the foreground. And now I can just wire this into our output color. And that's looking great. We've got our nice button here. But we also would like to add a drop shadow. And so let's go ahead and do that next. In order to make a drop shadow, we need to add a second Rectangle SDF node. So I'm going to bring that Rectangle SDF node down here. And we'll also wire in this same value for the corner radii. The thing that's going to be unique about this drop shadow, let's just add a saturate node here so that we can get a preview. And we also need to wire our dimensions into our drop shadow. There's our size. The thing that's going to be unique about our drop shadow is that we're going to increase the value of our edge max here so that instead of having sharp edges, our drop shadow is going to have blurry edges. So I'm just going to add a parameter here. And we're going to give this edge max value a value of 0.08. When I connect that up, what you can see now is that our drop shadow, instead of having a sharp edge, it has a blurry edge. And the other thing that we need to do with our drop shadow is move it down and to the right just a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to take our UV coordinates that we've generated here, and we need to add a move node. So let's drag in a move node. We'll connect up our UV coordinates. And then we're going to move it down and to the left, or to the right. And I'm going to move it a value of 0.01 vertically and also horizontally. And then we'll connect up our UVs there. And so now our drop shadow has moved ever so slightly over. Let's actually move it just a little bit more, maybe 0.02. There we go. And it looks like we may need to move it in the negative direction. So I'm going to add negates to this. And let's just increase it so we can tell for sure. Yeah, okay, so now we've got our drop shadow moving down and to the right. Cool, so for our drop shadow, what we want to do is take this value that we've calculated here and take this value that we've calculated for our drop shadow and find whichever is greater. So I'm going to take the maximum between our button mask and our drop shadow mask, and that is going to be our alpha value. So here you can see we've got our button mask and our drop shadow mask, and we can wire that, connect it to alpha. So now we've got our button color and we've got our output alpha. Now our drop shadow may be a little bit too big, and so let's scale it down just a little bit. So I'm going to come over here to our dimensions, and here where they're coming into size, I'm just going to multiply our dimensions by 0.95 to shrink down our drop shadow just a little bit to try to make it look a little bit nicer. Yeah, that worked. Okay, so now we've got our button and we've got our drop shadow. All right, now we could stop if all we wanted was something that looked nice, but we actually want to make our button functional. And so we want it to be able to do something when you press it, and we want to be able to do something when you mouse over it, and we want to be able to do something also when it's inactive. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to change our color, the color of our button when it's pressed. So I'm going to take our button color here, and we're going to multiply our button color by a value of 1.3. And this is going to be the pressed color. And so right here, I need to add a static switch. And so when the button is pressed, it's going to be this color multiplied by 1.3. And when it's not pressed, it's just going to be its regular color. All right, and now we need a new input parameter, and I'm going to make this a Boolean. So here, I'll copy this input parameter, and we're going to call this pressed, and we're going to set the type to Boolean, and I'm going to set a default value, static Boolean, to false, And then we're going to connect this up to our switch. All right, you can see that our preview window stopped working here, and that's because I set it to a Boolean, and it actually needs to be a static Boolean. There we go. All right, so this is our default value, and you can see when I set it to true, the button gets a little bit brighter. And just so that you can see what's going on, I'm going to make this really bright. Now you can see when I'm pressing the button gets brighter. Okay, the other thing that we need to do when the button gets pressed is move it down and to the right. And so I'm going to take our UV coordinates here, and we're going to take our pressed Boolean, and we're going to add a move node, just like this move node that we have here. So we're going to connect our UV coordinates up to this move node, and we're going to make it move 0.01 down and to the right. And we'll connect this up to what we were doing before. Actually, we need to add a static branch here, a switch. And so when the button is pressed, we're going to use these coordinates. And when it's not pressed, we're going to use these coordinates. So then we're just going to connect this up here. Okay, so now you can see when our pressed Boolean value is true, we're moving the button down. So if you watch the button over here, I'll set it to true, and it's moved down and to the right just a little bit. Actually, let's increase this amount, maybe 0.03, just so we can see what's happening. There we go. So when the button is pressed, it lightens up and it moves down. Cool, so we've got our pressed state. The other state that we need to add is selected. Oh, actually, you know what? I did this wrong. So when we move the button, when we press the button, it's actually supposed to get darker. And so let's go ahead and do that. So we've got a value of 0.03. We're going to make this 0.25. So now when we press the button, it's going to move down and get darker. But we also want to change the button color when it's selected. So let's move these nodes over here, and we'll create another Boolean. And we'll come up here, and this one's called pressed, but we're going to call this new one selected. And when the button is selected, we want it to get brighter. So this is where we're going to add our multiply. And let's just multiply it by 2. And so we'll add another static switch here. And we're going to switch based on the selected Boolean. So when it's selected, it's going to be brighter. And when it's not selected, it's going to be normal. All right, and then we'll just wire these in like this. And now we have our selected state. So if I set this Boolean to true, our button gets brighter. And when I set our selected Boolean to true, it's going to get darker and move down. Cool, so that's what we wanted. So when our button is selected, it brightens up. That's like when the mouse is over it. And then the last thing that we want to do is add one more state. And this one is active. And we're going to move this one over here. So instead of selected here, we're going to call this one active. And when our button is inactive, we're going to desaturate it. And we'll do that with a dot product node. So I'll add a dot product. And we're going to take the dot product of this, and I'll add in a vector 3 here. And we're going to give this a value of 0.21, 0.7152, and then 0.07. And these are the perceptual weights that convert color into grayscale based on the way that your eye works. You know, your eye is a lot more sensitive to green, a little bit less sensitive to red, and then the least sensitive to blue. And so we use these weights to convert a value from color to grayscale based on the way that your eye perceives things. Okay, so now we've got our color we've got our desaturated value, and we need to add another static switch here between the colored value and the desaturated value based on whether or not our button is active. Then we can wire that into our output color. So our active is set to false right now, so you can see it's nicely desaturated because of what we did with our dot product node here. And we'll set it to default to true so that it defaults to being active. Okay, so we've got everything set up. Let's just do a little bit of cleanup here. We want to order our inputs. This one's going to be 0. Our dimensions are going to be sort priority of 1. Our button color is going to be sort priority of 2. Our outline color is going to be a sort priority of 3. Our shadow color is going to be 4. Our selected Boolean is going to be 5. Pressed is going to be 6. And then active is going to be 7. Okay, so we've created a really nice material function here that creates a button. Let's go ahead and save it, and we'll switch over to our temp shader and bring it in and create a nice button. So here's our simple button material function, and we can wire up, oh, our alpha and color are out of order, so let's fix that really quick. We want to set our color to sort priority of 0 and our alpha to sort priority of 1. There we go. So now we can wire up our color and we can wire up our alpha, but we need to set our blend mode to translucent if we want alpha. So now we take our alpha and wire it to opacity. There we go. Now we have a nice button that has the drop shadow around the edge. And now we can control the states of the button. We could also change the button color, the outline color, the shadow color. Let's just see what happens if we change the states. So if we add some static bools here and connect these up to selected and pressed and active. So if our button is inactive, we'll get a nice grayscale version of the button. Let's activate it. And then if we press our button, it's going to go down and to the right. That's looking really good. And if we hover over the button, it's going to get brighter. Okay, so really nice. We've created this material function that creates a functioning button. And now we could use Blueprint to hook these values up to an actual button in the user interface to control how our button behaved if you mouse over it, if you click on it, etc. All right, well, that's our tutorial for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. It's pretty cool to be able to use a shader to make procedural shapes and patterns. And that's what this whole series is about. Next week, I think we're going to take our button just a little bit further and make our button look a little bit more polished and beautiful, or we're going to create a visually advanced button. So be sure to come back next week for that. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody, and have a great week.